October 31st, 1842, Magnolia Creek Plantation, South Carolina. The harvest moon hung fat and blood orange over the cotton fields, and Hannah Blackwood stirred the pot with hands that had learned to kill. Hannah, that was the name of the woman, who on this night of masks and shadows would serve her final meal as a slave. The kitchen house sat separate from the main manor, connected by nothing but packed dirt and 23 years of footsteps. Her footsteps, carrying trays of food that had never been meant for her own mouth. The air tasted of wood smoke and dying. Leaves. Somewhere in the distance, the field hands were singing, their voices carrying across the cotton like a prayer that would never be answered. But Hannah wasn't listening to prayers anymore. She was counting heartbeats. 7 heartbeats. 7 names written in her memory like scars. She was 41 years old, with calloused hands and eyes that had stopped crying 15 years ago. Her back bore the marks of Master Cornelius Whitmore's whip, her arms the burns from hot stoves, and hotter tempers. They had trained her to cook, to serve, to smile when they called her by names that weren't her own, but they had never trained her for this. The careful measuring of oleander petals, the patient grinding of castor beans, the slow accumulation of death disguised as dinner. Thomas Whitmore, James Whitmore, Cornelius Whitmore Jr., Margaret Whitmore, Sarah Whitmore Clayton, Dr. Edmund Hartwell, Overseer Pike Jenkins. 7 names that would choke on their own greed before dawn broke over the Magnolia Creek. Her daughter Mary had been the first to die, not from poison, from fever, from exhaustion, from being worked to death at 16 years old in these same cotton fields. Her son Samuel had been sold away when he was 12, his small hands already bleeding from picking cotton under the Carolina. Son? Her husband Jacob had been beaten to death for stealing bread, bread that Hannah had baked with her own hands, bread that she wasn't allowed to eat. This is the true story of Hannah Blackwood, who transformed from a woman who fed others into a woman who starved them of life itself. Before we continue with the video, drop a comment telling us where you're from and what time it is over there. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel. The Magnolia Creek Plantation stretched across 3,000 acres of South Carolina, lowland, where the Spanish moss hung like funeral shrouds and the air tasted of salt from the distant ocean. Hannah had been born here, raised here, buried her children here. She knew every creaking board in the kitchen house, every loose stone in the manor's foundation, every face that had ever looked through her as if she were invisible. The morning of October 31st started like every other morning for the past 23 years. Hannah rose before dawn, her feet finding the cold wooden floor of her cabin behind the kitchen house. The other house slaves, Mercy, old Tom, young Beulah, were already stirring, their movements as practiced and silent as her own. But today was different. Today Hannah's hands shook as she tied her head wrap, not from fear but from anticipation. The harvest moon celebration would bring all 7 of them together in the main dining room. It happened once a year, when the cotton had been picked and the money counted, when the Whitmore family gathered to toast their prosperity built on blackbacks and broken spirits. Master Cornelius Whitmore Sr. would sit at the head of the table, his pale hands soft from never touching work. His wife Margaret would flutter around in silk that cost more than Hannah's life was worth. Their sons Thomas and James would drink too much wine and speak too loudly about buying more land, more slaves, more human misery to fuel their wealth. Sarah Whitmore Clayton, the daughter who had married into Charleston society, but still came home to count her inheritance. Dr. Edmund Hartwell, the family physician who had watched Hannah's children suffer and die without lifting a finger to help because black lives weren't worth the medicine. And Pike Jenkins, the overseer who had wielded the whip that carved the map of pain across every slave's back on Magnolia Creek. Hannah had served them countless meals over the years. She had watched them eat food she had prepared with ingredients she had grown in the plantation garden, food that filled their bellies while her own children went hungry. She had smiled when they demanded it, curtsied when they expected it, accepted their cruelty as if it were weather, natural, unavoidable, beyond her control. But October 31st, 1842 was the day weather changed. The kitchen house smelled of sage and thyme, of roasting fowl and baking bread. Hannah moved through her domain like a priestess conducting a ritual, her hands steady now, her purpose clear. The other slaves worked around her, unaware that this would be the last meal they would ever serve to the Whitmore family. Mercy chopped vegetables with the kind of mechanical precision that came from decades of repetition. Old Tom tended the fire in the great hearth, his weathered face reflecting the flames. Young Beulah, barely 16 and still new to the kitchen, followed Hannah's movements with wide eyes, trying to learn the secret recipes that had been passed down through generations of enslaved women. But Hannah's real secrets weren't written in any recipe book. They were growing in the garden behind the kitchen house, hidden among the herbs and vegetables that no white person had ever bothered to learn about. Oleander, beautiful and deadly, its pink flowers hiding enough poison to stop a heart. Castor, beans, innocent-looking seeds that contained ricin, a death that moved slow and sure through the body. Foxglove with its purple bells that could slow a heartbeat to nothing. Pokeweed berries, bitter and toxic, that could be ground into any dark sauce without detection. They called it seasoning, but it was really justice. Hannah had been planning this meal for 3 years, ever since the day they buried Mary in the slave cemetery behind the cotton gin. 3 years of careful observation, of noting who ate what, who had which preferences, who could be counted on to clean their plate. 3 years of learning exactly how much poison each plant contained, how to prepare it, how to hide its taste, among the rich gravies and complex spices that the Whitmore family expected from their prize cook. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had been taught to cook by her own mother, who had learned from her mother before her, an unbroken chain of black women feeding white families while their own children starved. Now she would use that same knowledge to break the chain forever. Past lived in Hannah's hands like a scar that never healed. She had been 7 years old when they first brought her into the kitchen house, small enough to reach into tight spaces, quick enough to avoid the worst of the cook's temper. Her mother, Rosa, had been the head cook then, a woman whose smile could warm a room, but whose eyes held the deep sadness of someone who had lost too much to ever fully heal. Rosa had taught Hannah everything: how to season rice so it sang on the tongue, how to roast fowl until the skin crackled like autumn leaves, how to bake bread that rose like hope in the morning air. But more than cooking, Rosa had taught Hannah how to survive, how to be invisible when anger was looking for a target, how to smile when every instinct screamed to fight, how to endure when endurance was the only choice left. "Remember, baby girl," Rosa had whispered to 7-year-old Hannah as they kneaded dough by candlelight. "We feed them, but we don't belong to them. Not our hearts, not our souls. They can own our bodies, but they can't own what's inside us. Remember that." Hannah remembered. She remembered every word, every lesson, every moment of tenderness that her mother had stolen from the harsh reality of their lives. She remembered the day Rosa died, worked to death at 52, her hands still flour-dusted when they found her collapsed in the kitchen house. She remembered taking over Rosa's duties at 17, younger than she should have been, but old enough to understand that childhood was a luxury slaves couldn't afford. She remembered meeting Jacob at 18, a field hand with gentle eyes and hands that could coax music from a homemade fiddle. She remembered their wedding ceremony, conducted in secret in the slave quarters, with old Tom speaking words over them that held more meaning than any legal document ever could. She remembered the joy of carrying their first child, the way Jacob would place his hand on her growing belly and whisper prayers for a future neither of them truly believed could exist. Mary. Beautiful Mary, born on a spring morning when the dogwood trees were blooming white like baptism robes. Mary who had her father's musical hands and her mother's stubborn streak. Mary who had never lived a day as anything other than property, but who somehow maintained a spark of joy that made the other slaves smile just by watching her laugh. Samuel came 2 years later, serious and thoughtful from birth, as if he understood the weight of the world he had been born into. He was the one who asked questions that couldn't be answered, who wanted to know why the sky was the same color for everyone, but freedom came in different shades. Samuel, who learned to read by watching young Master Thomas's lessons through the window, who carved letters in the dirt until Hannah had to smooth them away to keep him safe. For 12 years, Hannah had a family. For 12 precious years, she had something worth protecting, worth enduring for, worth believing in. Jacob would play his fiddle in the evenings, soft melodies that drifted across the slave quarters, like whispered promises. Mary would dance to her father's music, her bare feet stirring up dust that caught the firelight like scattered stars. Samuel would sit beside Hannah as she mended clothes, asking her to tell him stories about places neither of them had ever seen, but both could. Imagine they called it the good years, but they were really borrowed time. The first blow came when Samuel turned 12. Master Cornelius needed money for a new carriage, new clothes for his wife, new luxuries to display his wealth. Samuel was strong for his age, intelligent, valuable. The slave trader who came to Magnolia Creek that autumn looked at Samuel the way other men might look at livestock, calculating worth in dollars and cents rather than heartbeats and dreams. Hannah begged. She fell to her knees in front of Master Cornelius, her pride as worthless as dust, and begged him not to take her son. She offered to work without payment, to take on extra duties, to do anything he asked if he would just let her keep Samuel. But Master Cornelius looked through her as if she were invisible, as if her tears were no more significant than morning dew that would burn off by noon. "He's not your son," Master Cornelius had said, his voice flat and certain. "He's my property, and I'll do with my property as I see fit." They took Samuel on a Tuesday morning in October, the same month that would later become Hannah's month of reckoning. She watched the wagon disappear down the tree-lined drive, carrying her son toward a future she couldn't protect him from, toward a life she couldn't share or soften or survive with him. Jacob held her as she collapsed, his own tears falling silently into her hair, his fiddle broken across his knee because music had no place in a world that could steal children from their mother's arms. Mary tried to fill the silence that Samuel left behind. She sang while she worked in the garden, told stories to the younger children, brought wildflowers to her mother when words weren't enough to heal the wound of loss. But Mary was growing up too fast, her child's body developing into the curves that made white men look at slave women with a hunger that had nothing to do with food. At 16, Mary was beautiful. At 16, Mary was doomed. The fever that took her came suddenly, burning through her body like wildfire through dry cotton. Dr. Hartwell came when summoned, but he barely looked at Mary, barely touched her burning forehead, barely acknowledged that she was dying right there in front of him. "It's just a slave," he had said to Master Cornelius, packing his medical bag with hands that could have saved her. "Not worth the medicine." Hannah held Mary as she died, watched the light fade from eyes that had seen too little joy and too much suffering. Mary's last words were for Samuel, wondering aloud if he was safe, if he remembered them, if he knew how much they loved him. Hannah promised her dying daughter that Samuel was fine, that he was happy, that he was free. Lies that felt like prayers, words that could comfort the dying, even if they couldn't heal the living. Jacob broke after Mary died. The fiddle stayed broken, the music died, and something inside him shattered beyond repair. He started taking risks, small acts of rebellion that grew larger and more dangerous as his grief consumed his caution. He stole food from the kitchen house, not because he was hungry, but because he wanted to feel like he had some control over his life. He talked back to the overseers, not because he expected anything to change, but because staying silent felt like swallowing poison. The bread was the final straw. Just bread, the same bread Hannah baked every morning, the same loaves that filled the manor house with warmth while the slave quarters went cold. Jacob took one loaf, just one, to share with the children in the quarters who hadn't eaten in 2 days. Pike Jenkins caught him walking back from the kitchen house, the bread still warm in his hands. They beat Jacob to death in front of the slave quarters, in front of Hannah, in front of everyone who had ever loved him or been loved by him. Pike. Jenkins wielded the whip until Jacob's back was more blood than skin, until his breathing stopped, until the man who had made music from nothing became nothing himself. Hannah didn't cry. She just counted the lashes, memorized the sound of leather against flesh, stored away the memory of Pike Jenkins's face, twisted with the pleasure of causing pain. 47 lashes. She counted every one. October 30th, 1842. The day before the harvest moon celebration. Hannah stood in her kitchen house, surrounded by the tools of her trade, and felt the last piece of her humanity die. She had endured the sale of her son, the death of her daughter, the murder of her husband. She had swallowed her rage, buried her grief, and continued to serve the people who had destroyed everything she had ever loved. But she was done serving. Tonight she would cook. Tomorrow they would feast. And by dawn, the Whitmore family would learn what happened when you pushed a woman past the breaking point of endurance. The castor beans had been drying for weeks, hidden in the root cellar beneath the kitchen house. Hannah ground them carefully, her hands steady despite the magnitude of what she was preparing. The ricin extracted from the beans was tasteless, odorless, and absolutely lethal. Mixed into the rich brown gravy that would accompany the roasted fowl, it would be undetectable until it was too late. The oleander petals went into the wine sauce, their bitter poison masked by the complex flavors of herbs and spices that the Whitmore family had grown to expect from Hannah's cooking. Pink flowers that had bloomed in the plantation garden, watered by slave tears and fertilized by slave blood, now transformed into instruments of justice. Foxglove for the bread pudding, its purple essence mixed with cinnamon and nutmeg until it became invisible. Pokeweed berries ground into the cranberry sauce, their natural bitterness hidden among the tart sweetness of the fruit. Every dish contained its own form of death, carefully measured and precisely applied. Hannah worked through the night, her movements as familiar as prayer, her purpose as clear as scripture. She thought of Mary as she prepared the fowl, remembering her daughter's laugh. She thought of Samuel as she kneaded the bread, wondering if he was still alive somewhere, still dreaming of freedom. She thought of Jacob as she stirred the gravy, hearing the echo of his music and the rhythm of her wooden spoon against the pot. The other slaves helped without knowing what they were helping with. Mercy arranged the dining room, polishing silver that had been paid for with human misery. Old Tom built up the fires, warming rooms that had never shown warmth to those who maintained them. Young Beulah set out the fine china, handling dishes. That cost more than her life was worth. They called it preparation, but it was really resurrection. Hannah Blackwood was being reborn in the kitchen house, transformed from victim into agent of justice. From the woman who had fed her oppressors into the woman who would finally, permanently, free herself from them. The harvest moon reached its peak at midnight, hanging over Magnolia Creek like a bloodshot eye. In the main dining room of the manor house, 7 people gathered around a table laden with the finest meal Hannah Blackwood had ever prepared. They came dressed in their harvest moon finery, silk and velvet that had been bought with cotton picked by dying hands, jewelry that sparkled with light, while human souls were kept in darkness. Master Cornelius Whitmore Sr. took his place at Ahiu, the head of the table, 62 years old and soft around the middle from decades of eating well while others starved. His hair had gone white, but his eyes remained the same cold blue that Hannah had learned to fear as a child. Those eyes had looked at her children as if they were livestock, had seen Samuel's intelligence and Mary's beauty as nothing more than dollar signs in a ledger book. Margaret Whitmore sat to his right, her pale hands fluttering over the table settings like dying moths. She wore diamonds that caught the candlelight, gems that had been purchased with the profits from human suffering. She had never acknowledged Hannah as anything more than a cooking mechanism, had never spoken her name, had never shown the slightest awareness that the woman who fed her family had feelings, thoughts, or a heart that could break. Thomas and James Whitmore, 34 and 31 respectively, sat across from each other with the easy confidence of men who had never doubted their place in the world. Thomas had been the one to negotiate Samuel's sale, had shaken hands with the slave trader, while Hannah's son cried for his mother. James had been present when they beat Jacob to death, had watched with the same expression he might wear while observing the weather. Sarah Whitmore Clayton had traveled from Charleston for the celebration, bringing with her the refined cruelty of society fashion. She was 36, married to a banker, and mother to 3 children who would grow up believing that owning other human beings was as natural as breathing. She had been 16 when Hannah's own Mary was born, but where Mary had died from fever and neglect, Sarah had grown into a woman who could wear silk while others wore chains. Dr. Edmund Hartwell sat at the foot of the table, his medical bag resting beside his chair like a promise that would never be kept. He was 58, had been the plantation doctor for 20 years, and had never once treated a slave with the same care he showed to a white patient. His hands, which could have saved Mary's life, were manicured and soft, unmarked by the suffering he could have prevented but chose to ignore. And Pike Jenkins, the overseer, 43 years old and built like the violence he represented. His hands bore the calluses of whip handles, his arms the strength that came from years of breaking human spirits. He had killed Jacob as casually as other men might swat flies, had shown no more emotion during the beating than Hannah showed, while stirring soup. 7 people. 7 names written in blood and memory. 7 lives that would end before the harvest moon set. Hannah served the first course herself, carrying the silver tray with the same grace she had cultivated over 23 years of forced servitude. The bread pudding, warm and fragrant with cinnamon, hiding the foxglove that would slow their hearts to stopping. She placed a serving before each diner, her face a mask of the deference they expected, her hands steady despite the magnitude of what she was serving. "Exceptional as always, Hannah," Master Cornelius said without looking at her, his attention already focused on the pudding. He took the first bite, chewing thoughtfully, savoring flavors that would be among his last. "You've outdone yourself." "Tonight," Hannah curtsied, her eyes downcast in the submissive pose that had protected her for decades. "Thank you, Master," she said, her voice carrying the same practiced humility that had hidden her rage for so long. But inside, she was counting. 1 bite, 2 bites. The foxglove working its way into his bloodstream like justice, finally finding its target. The others followed suit, complimenting the food they were eating, unaware that each bite brought them closer to the reckoning that Hannah had been preparing for 3 years. Margaret nibbled delicately, commenting on the texture. Thomas and James ate with the hearty appetite of men who had never worried about where their next meal would come from. Sarah praised the seasoning, while Dr. Hartwell nodded approvingly. Pike Jenkins, never one for conversation, simply ate with the mechanical efficiency of a man accustomed to consuming whatever was placed before him. The second course came 20 minutes later, roasted fowl with the rich brown gravy that contained castor bean poison, cranberry sauce bitter with pokeweed, vegetables that had been grown in plantation soil and seasoned with plantation revenge. Hannah served each plate personally, her movements ritual precise, her heart beating steady as a funeral drum. They called it dinner, but it was really communion. Hannah was serving them their sins, prepared with her own hands and seasoned with the tears of everyone they had destroyed. Mary's fever, Samuel's tears, Jacob's blood, all of it mixed into this final meal that would balance the scales that had been tilted toward cruelty for far too long. The wine came with the third course, deep red liquid that matched the color of the harvest moon hanging outside the dining room windows. The wine sauce, infused with oleander poison, complemented the meat perfectly. Hannah poured each glass personally, watching as they raised their goblets in toasts to their continued prosperity, their continued ownership of human souls, their continued belief that they were entitled to everything while others deserved nothing. 2. Another profitable year, Master Cornelius announced, raising his glass. The others followed suit, their voices joining in agreement, their glasses touching in celebration of wealth built on human misery. Hannah watched from the corner of the dining room as they drank deeply, as the oleander poison joined the foxglove, and castor bean ricin already working through their systems. The plants she had cultivated in secret, the knowledge she had gathered in silence, the patience she had cultivated through years of seemingly endless suffering, all of it coming together. In this moment of perfect, poisonous justice, by the time they realized something was wrong, it would be too late. The poisons Hannah had chosen worked slowly, giving her time to serve every course, to complete the meal, to stand witness as the people who had destroyed her family finally faced consequences for their actions. Master Cornelius was the first to show symptoms, his face flushing red as his heart struggled against the foxglove working through his bloodstream. His hand went to his chest, confusion clouding his features as he experienced the first physical discomfort his pampered life had ever known. "I feel strange," he said, his voice uncertain for perhaps the first time in his 62 years of life. His breathing became labored, his usual commanding presence diminishing as his body began to fail him. Margaret reached for her husband's hand, but her own was shaking from the ricin poisoning that was beginning to attack her nervous system. The diamonds on her fingers caught the candlelight, but her face was growing pale, her carefully applied makeup beginning to run as perspiration beaded on her forehead. Thomas and James looked at each other across the table, both experiencing the nausea and cramping that signaled the castor bean poison working its way through their digestive systems. Their confident expressions were replaced by growing alarm as they realized that something was terribly wrong. Sarah tried to stand, but the oleander in her wine had begun affecting her heart rhythm, making her dizzy and disoriented. She gripped the edge of the table, her Charleston refinement cracking under the pressure of physical distress she had never been required to endure. Dr. Hartwell, with his medical training, was the first to understand what was happening. His physician's knowledge allowed him to recognize the symptoms of poisoning, but his realization came too late to save himself or anyone else. The very expertise that he had denied to Hannah's children now served only to make him aware of his approaching death. Pike Jenkins, strong as he was, felt the combined effects of multiple plant poisons working together to shut down his body's systems. The hands that had wielded whips now shook uncontrollably, the arms that had beaten Jacob to death now weak as a newborn's. Hannah stood in the corner of the dining room and watched them die. She watched without crying, without speaking, without showing any emotion, beyond a quiet satisfaction that justice was finally being served. She had spent 3 years planning this moment, had endured decades of cruelty to reach this point, had lost everything that mattered to her in the process of learning how to take everything from them. They called for help, but Hannah was the only help available, and she had already given them all the help she intended to provide. They begged for antidotes that didn't exist, for mercy they had never shown, for compassion they had spent their lives refusing to acknowledge in others. Master. Cornelius died first, his heart finally stopping under the combined assault of Foxglove and the weight of his own cruelty. His last words were not an apology or a plea for forgiveness, but a demand that Hannah save him, still trying to command her, even as death claimed him. Margaret followed minutes later, her body finally rebelling against decades of comfortable living built on others' suffering. The diamonds she wore continued to sparkle, even as the light faded from her eyes, beautiful and cold as the woman who had worn them. Thomas and James died within moments of each other, their bodies shutting down, from ricin poisoning. Brothers in life, brothers in death, brothers in the cruelty they had inflicted, and the justice they had finally received. Sarah's heart gave out as the oleander completed its work, her body crumpling in the silk dress that had cost more than most slaves would see in a lifetime. Her last thoughts were not of her own children, but of anger that her property, her human property, had dared to strike back. They called it murder, but the slaves knew it was something else entirely. They knew it was the sound of chains breaking, the sight of dignity restored, the taste of freedom served one final time by a woman who had spent her life being hungry for everything she was never allowed to have. The Magnolia Creek plantation was abandoned within a year, its reputation poisoned as thoroughly as its former owners had been. The other plantations in the area tightened their control over their enslaved populations, increased their surveillance, hired more overseers, added more restrictions. But they could not unsee what Hannah had shown them, that the people they treated as property were human beings capable of terrible, beautiful, justified revenge. Hannah's story spread like wildfire through the underground networks that connected slave communities across the South. It became a cautionary tale for masters and an inspiration for the enslaved, proof that even in a system designed to crush the human spirit, that spirit could find ways to rise up, to fight back, to claim justice when justice was denied. Her name lived on in whispered conversations, in the herbs that grew wild in plantation gardens, in the hands of every enslaved woman who prepared food for those who owned her. Hannah Blackwood, who had transformed from victim into victor, from the woman who served into the woman who was finally forever served. The harvest moon still rises every October over what was once Magnolia Creek Plantation, now nothing but ruins and memories. But those who know the story say that on Halloween night, when the moon is full and blood orange in the sky, You can still smell the phantom scent of her final meal drifting across the abandoned fields. Herbs and spices and justice served cold. And perfect and final. If this story haunts you, it's because it represents every person who was pushed beyond the breaking point and chose to push back. Hannah Blackwood's revenge was terrible and complete, but it was also deeply, undeniably human. Subscribe and share with those who understand that sometimes the only choice left is the choice to be free, no matter the cost.